historic cold front came through much of the US. Basically, if you imagine an inverted triangle that is, sort of pointing down to Texas and covers much of the upper Midwest, the polar vortex, I guess, collapsed, whatever that means. I don't know exactly, but it let a bunch of Arctic air flow south. And I've been using this as sort of like the benchmark for how crazy this was. If you design HVAC systems, you have to understand what's the hottest temperature this is going to be exposed to and what's the coldest temperature this is going to be exposed to, because that's how you size how much AC you need and how much heat you need. The manual that tells you what this weather data is, if you looked at the low in Dallas, which at least the one day I was looking at it was 5 degrees, that's 25 degrees less than the most conservative low that the manual tells you to consider, right? And that's based on a 50-year data set with a 99.6% confidence. So like 5 degrees was just like considered so improbable it wasn't even worth thinking about, and it happened, right? And so essentially this, stressed the grid massively, right? First, it was just an economic impact. So I remember the first couple of days of this, everyone on energy Twitter was like, oh my God, prices are so high, right? So the price of electricity went up to its regulated cap of $9,000 per megawatt hour. That's $9 a kilowatt hour. Typically in Texas, power is like 9 cents a kilowatt hour, crazy stuff, 100x the normal price. And, for a long time, that was just sort of an economic issue. Basically, the people who sell power to customers sell it at fixed rates with locked in contracts for the most part. So those retailers of power were, getting crunched because they had to cover their contracts in the spot market if they weren't hedged enough. There's going to be a bunch of bankruptcies from this. But then there are also a handful of people on the real-time rate who got like $13,000 electricity bills for like 6 days, like really, really crazy stuff. But then it escalated beyond just an economic issue and, became like a crazy health and safety issue because the pipelines and the gas power plants and even the gas wells themselves started freezing up. And so
which is just wild to think about.
Yeah, Texas, the land of gas,
Yeah.
right? There's so much damn gas in that state that they just flare it because there's no way to get it to market. And they couldn't get enough gas within the state to run power plants, right? So they had to start, issuing rolling blackouts to at least keep some of the system up. And now it's actually been understood that they were minutes away from a total system failure where the entire Texas grid would have shut down. And it can be really hard to start a grid back up. To black start a grid, you have to like isolate a section of it that has a generator, bring up that section, do another section, sync them together, and then do that like 50 times, right? It can take like weeks to black start a grid.
And that's what I'd heard was they were minutes away from their grid being out for at least weeks, maybe even months. So in case anyone hasn't heard what happened, let's take a step back. I think probably the biggest thing, there's 2 elements to this that really explains this. If obviously the weather component, but the phenomenon with this is the fact that Texas is Texas. And if anyone knows how the grid looks, you really have the West interconnection grid, the East interconnection grid, and it goes down the middle of the country. And then randomly you have Texas, and that kind of falls into its own grid. And so traditionally they haven't had to deal with a lot of these issues. And there's the reasons for that partially was so they could kind of get around some FERC regulation by doing their own thing. And then I believe it was 2001, 2003, where they decided to deregulate some of their utility markets, which I thought was it's an interesting concept. And I think the best analogy I've been able to describe it to is like what you experience with telecom. If you have Verizon like T-Mobile or Sprint, they don't actually own the cell towers. They're usually renting space and cell capacity from AT&T and Verizon and other providers. And that's essentially what this deregulation kind of allowed for, is for a lot of these utilities to kind of come in and not always have the infrastructure to kind of upkeep, but they could essentially sell to the end user. And through that, you kind of started having a lot of really unique things happen between not properly weatherizing the wind turbines, the natural gas plants, and all these things. And it really did kind of create a perfect storm. I don't know if there's any other kind of backstory for what has happened that either of you want to kind of add to that you thought was really interesting. But I think that those, to me, hit a lot of the highlights that were just really unique about the situation, and is going to be a long discussion of how they move forward.
Yeah, I think the reason for the power plants not being winterized is like a little bit less of the deregulation of Texas and a little bit more in that a lot of, I mean, I think a lot of power plants went through deregulation and weren't winterized. And then in the Northeast, and Duncan fact check me here, but I believe that there were basically similar kind of issues at some point, and then it was sort of like, if you want to participate in the capacity market and be considered like a firm and reliable resource, you must winterize your plant. And Texas doesn't have a capacity market, so it doesn't really have that same requirement. They could have that requirement, obviously, in other ways. You don't need a capacity market to mandate winterization to participate in a grid.
Right.
But it is sort of the way that it happens in a lot of other markets today.
Well, I think that was actually a better way to articulate it, because the weatherization thing, I think what was unique about that really comes out of what they saw, I believe, happen in 2011, where something similar did happen before. And that was supposed to be the wake up call, to hopefully address some of these issues. And unfortunately, that just never happened.
I mean, I'll give my take here, which is like, I think it's all about what we assume the frequency of extreme weather is going to be, right? Because whether you're an energy market or capacity market, or, you know, to what extent the market's deregulated or not, and like, I don't know, there's a lot of details there. I think generally, though, whoever owns and operates the plant, whether it's a old school vertically integrated utility or, you know, a fully independent power producer, what they want to know is, if I'm going to spend money to upgrade this plant, you know, when is that going to pay off? Like, when am I going to need that, right? And in the Texas construct, what that means is, like, when are prices going to go to $9,000 a megawatt hour again because of a cold front? And if I don't weatherize, I'm not going to be able to capture that. And I mean, as someone who develops financed projects of a very different kind, but it's like a similar process, like, if I said one of these might happen in the next 25 years, I would not get approval to include that cost. If I said one of these might happen in the next 10 years, I'd be very, very lucky to get approval to include that cost, even if it's like a huge payout. If I said one of these might happen in the next 5 years, like, now we're starting to talk, right? I I don't know specifically whether this Texas cold front, like, was statistically normal or not. Like, I don't know, a lot of stuff to get into there, but I do think what we know is more extreme weather is probably going to happen with more frequency, right? And how do we actually quantify that and think about that is like a huge lever on how we build our infrastructure, regardless of who owns it and pays for it. Because, you know, just like the sort of like HVAC design guidebook I was talking about, the most conservative thing they say is, we look at this data set and then we cover 99.6 of the hours in the data set. Like, one, that's an arbitrary choice. Should that be 99.9? Should that be 85? Like, who knows? And two, like, the data's wrong, right? The historical data is not representative of where we are anymore. So my view on this is, like, that's what this is about. I think an easy fix will probably be just mandating plants winterize. But, like, we're going to see this happen with all sorts of stuff, right? In LA County in the summer, it hit 120 degrees, which is just the highest it ever hit, right? Sorry, 121. And a lot of power systems and HVAC systems and everything else wasn't prepared for that. We're going to see floodplains change, and, you know, maybe critical infrastructure is in what are the new floodplains. Like, all this stuff is changing, and we don't really have, like, standard practices for assuming what forward looking weather is going to be. We've only been able to look backward. So
Yeah.
for me, not to kind of blow this topic up, but for me, like that is the crazy thing in this. It's like there's probably a solution to the Texas problem that can just be implemented, and I'm sure ERCOT's going to figure that out. But like over the next 40, 50 years, like stuff like this is going to keep happening. And like we have to figure out how we deal with this across a variety of situations. That's my concern.
Right. And like, how do you anticipate what those risks are now? Right. It reminds me like post Sandy.
Right.
You know, Sandy had so many people had generators on the ground floor, and then they all flooded. And everyone was like, oh, wait, maybe they shouldn't be on the ground floor because they could flood. But it's like no one had ever thought about it before because that was never the issue before. And suddenly you're faced with something. And obviously, right, like Texas, I think there's some questions of whether like nobody had seen it before because there was like some cold related outages in the 90s and then in 2011 and then in 2021. But there is still this question of like, what is the frequency and like, what is that economic drive? And so, and that's going to vary, wildly in terms of what people think the value is and like what people think, I think especially, again, I'm not going to like try to speak to the culture of Texas, but like, regulation solves that really easily. It probably will in this case because there's enough of a big issue, but it could also not.
And there's like a clear thing to fix here, right? Like,
right. And it's like not crazy expensive, right? Like what, like weatherizing a plant is, I know nothing about the economics, but from my understanding, it's not like it's something you wouldn't pay for if you didn't think you needed it, but it's not going to like make all of these places go bankrupt.
Yeah,
and the potential.
Economically, attractive power plants in the Northeast, and
exactly.
we weatherize it. It's fine. Like,
it's fine.
Yeah. I do think there's one crazy thing though, which is the gas supply was disrupted too. So even if you weatherize the plant, can you get gas to it? This is also something we face in the Northeast, and our solution is have the plant be dual fuel, have a massive oil tank next to it, and every winter Massachusetts fires up its oil turbines, right? Or switches the fuel to them because gas becomes scarce when people on the coldest days are heating with it, which is exactly what happened in Texas. So like, not an awesome outcome, right? Like burning fuel and fuel oil in peaker plants, but like that could also be what weatherizing means,
right?
Or winterizing, sorry. So I think like that's like a bigger thing. But if it's just kind of like make sure the instrumentation and like pressure sensors and stuff can deal with the cold, like I think they should probably just mandate it and get it over with.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, what are your thoughts about just kind of ERCOT and Texas being separate from the other interconnections? Do you think that may be what part of this regulation includes, is to make it easier for in some sort of situation moving forward that it becomes part of the grid? So it allow for that, or do you think that's too far out?
Anytime soon. I mean,
that's fine. I'm just curious from your perspective.
I think for two reasons. I mean, one, I think is it would be bringing in potential like more federal oversight. Right. But I think also like in this particular instance, the specific neighboring areas weren't doing that great either. They were also having like rolling outages, and it wasn't nearly as dire of a situation as Texas was in, but there wasn't a lot. My understanding is there wasn't necessarily like a lot of help readily available. Now, maybe if like in the future, we have like stronger cross grid interconnection, Texas will want to reconsider that when we have like, high voltage transmission, like crossing the country and everything's like great and wonderful. Maybe Texas will be like, oh, that looks cool. But right now, I think they're like, wouldn't have really helped us. We don't really want to deal with federal things. Like, we'll fix what we need to fix and we'll just deal with it.
And part of the reason I bring it up, it's definitely a one-off, is people are using El Paso right now as kind of the example that they were able to stay up. Even it's not obviously the largest Texas city, but they had blackouts, but they were only usually, from what I've been told, minutes to hours versus having such
they were
severe...
actual rolling blackouts, right?
Right.
ERCOT said they were doing rolling blackouts, but then they just didn't have the power to unroll people.
Exactly.
Which I don't think is the proper term for that, but
I think that is in itself is a really interesting question to ask, which is like, of course, how do we prevent these issues? Two, when they occur, how do we respond to them better? Right. And I think, the rolling blackouts topic is interesting. Like ideally, like there's an optimal way to institute rolling blackouts that minimizes harm to people, that relies on like the law of large numbers and like spreads out the burden, that is done maybe with a high sort of like resolution geographically and also temporally. So, my block can lose power for an hour, but then it rotates to the next block, right? And all this stuff would be enabled, if utilities could, invest in more sort of like people call this like situational awareness and sensors and all sorts of stuff. I think that's a really important discussion because right now the way it works is just like we have a couple of feeders we prioritize because there's like a hospital here and this thing there. And like if you're on that feeder, you're lucky. You're not losing power. Everyone else is for like 2 days, right? I think I'm very interested in that conversation. Blackouts are going to happen again. And I would love to empower utilities to like, do it in a really good way. Right. But
what I have read on Texas is that they were planning on rotating people more, but they just couldn't undo it because they lost too much generation. So I think like part of the miscommunication was they said we're going to have to be rolling blackouts. And then so much generation was shed that they were just like, we just can't bring these people back. And there's like no, growing. And then all you can serve then are like the absolutely critical areas. And that's why like the areas around hospitals stayed open. I think in another situation where they hadn't lost quite as much generation, just a little bit of generation, you would have seen more rolling situation.
Totally. Yeah. I even meant like relative to how it works today. Like you could even have it more like,
even more granular,
more surgical kind of. But it's a great point. They were like in a tremendously difficult situation, and even normal rolling blackouts weren't really possible.
Yeah, and I think one question I have that I haven't seen discussed a lot is like, had there been a lower demand in the days leading up to the outages through like promotion of cold climate heat pumps instead of electric resistance heating, or better weatherization of like homes and businesses, how might that have like helped reduce some of the outages themselves, right? From these plants that had to like gear up super fast and then go to like 100% and then just like broke down. Like, are there ways to think about, like, it became very much a supply side issue, but if you can mitigate some of the demand, could you have reduced some of that impact?
Totally. I think that's a great question, right? And I think electrification plays in here too, right? Because like, I don't know the exact number, but like half of homes are heated with gas and half of homes have like electric heat in Texas, which is unique, right? In the Northeast here, everybody's gas basically, or oil. There was a big reason plants couldn't get gas is because everybody was burning gas in their houses. You could say, well, electrification would have worsened the problem because it would have made more electric demand. But if it was with efficient cold climate heat pumps, it might have actually been like a net gain, right? Less gas demand in homes, lets the plants run, powering efficient heat pumps. Like all of that could have worked out better. Plus, to your point, like a little bit more insulation, a little bit of air sealing. And I think you could imagine a system that didn't end up in such a severe situation.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to visit our website, connectingthegrid.com. There you can listen to our podcasts, contact us about sponsorship, or even be a guest on Grid Connections. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a positive rating on your favorite podcast or video streaming service. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out a lot too. Thank you again, and I look forward to us learning more together soon.